Why have we not explored nuclear? Because nuclear has been known to be clean. Is it just because people are scared about the whole Chernobyl thing, 50 years ago, that it might happen here, all that? Like,
Welcome to the Canadian Mortgage Show. Here are mortgage professionals Alex Pang and Alex Shanks to cut through the BS and educate Canadians on all things mortgages and real estate.
welcome to episode 98 of the Canadian Mortgage Show. Alex Pang here alongside Alex Shanks. Now, before we begin, make sure you hit that follow and subscribe button on Spotify and YouTube. Help us grow the community on both platforms. Now, Alex, we have a special guest. No more teasing anymore. We have Heather Exner-Pirot here from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's a senior fellow and director of natural resources, energy, and environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She serves as a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada and managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook. She's an internationally recognized scholar and policy expert whose work focuses on natural resource development, energy security, critical minerals, Arctic governance, Indigenous economic participation, and Canadian competitiveness. Wow, that's a mouthful. Heather, welcome to the show.
That's a big list. I mean, I don't want to say what ours is because it's not going to look as good as Heather's theirs, but that's for sure.
So Heather, you've had a busy last couple weeks since all these announcements have come out, haven't you?
Yeah, well, the list you just named are all the things that, that are kind of in the news. And it's nice. I often joke, I was often the skunk at the garden party, kind of in Canadian political thinking the last few years. Oil wasn't very popular. Resource extraction was not very popular. And we finally turned that corner. And the rest of the country is seeing what I've been seeing is that, this is very critical to our national security, our foreign policy, and obviously our competitiveness. And it's great to see a commodities upswing for Canada and particularly where I live in Alberta.
Yeah, so let's kind of unpack all these news. Like the first thing, us in the West Coast, there's this Canada-Alberta oil pipeline planned to the West Coast. And even Danielle Smith saying that, hey, all the producers are given the green light to double oil production. Like, how's that going to help our economy and everything? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, so the way that our bread is buttered in Canada is oil exports. It's obviously our biggest export. It's probably the most influential export, only because oil is the most important commodity in the world, and obviously with the Strait of Hormuz closure, that's obviously a big deal. It's our biggest export to the United States. It's the thing that the United States needs from us most. So that's been in sharper focus in the last 20 months. Give us a little bit of leverage in that relationship. So all those things have kind of, come together to highlight the importance of oil to the economy. And it's also, generally good for the dollar. We used to be much more of a petrodollar, not quite as much as before, but it still brings in foreign exchange. And so any more increase in growth in production tends to be very good for the Canadian economy. We've all seen the graphs. You guys have seen that graph of usually everything is going up until 2015, and then there was kind of a collapse. And the Canadian economy has been very stagnant in that lost decade. Well, a big part of that boost, from 2000, from the financial crisis to 2015, was the oil sands build out, that first initial build out, where you attracted a couple $100 billion of investment into the country, most of it foreign investment, on top of a commodity cycle in general. And when you love to see that again, when you see that trajectory again, and that is the opportunity we have ahead of us now with the new commodities upswing, with some of the rules loosening up from the Trudeau era, with that global demand looking for a more reliable supplier. We have that chance to that scale of investment again. And the last thing I'll say, Alex, because people often think oil is a pure Alberta story. To make oil sands oil, you need a lot of natural gas and a lot of natural gas liquids. And that is mostly what BC produces. And the more oil production you have, the more development you have of oil sands, the more you're going to have to produce that from BC. And the price is going to go up, and that means the royalty is going to go up. You're not getting very good royalties on natural gas prices today. The more the oil sands can grow, the more likely that you are in BC to capture those good royalties.
And that's like when you talked about the Strait of Hormuz there, Heather, the one thing I thought back in remember when it got blocked because of a big tanker back, was that, I think 2021 or 2022? I mean, I thought we all would have learned from there of hey, you know what, this massive trade route, we need to make sure we have backups. That's when inflation really spiked. when that happened there as well, because it blocked so many of the goods. And it's like, again, this is happening, and I hope Canadians learn from it of like, hey, we shouldn't be relying on one single spot for such a large amount. And that's where obviously the talks with Kuzma and everything for US and Canada, it makes it a bit hard. But hopefully can send it elsewhere. It's like, hey, if you guys don't want to trade nice with us, we'll go somewhere else then.
Yeah, and for a long time, we didn't need to really to go anywhere else. The United States, some of the guys around here called it, a bottomless pit. There's a more elegant term, but basically, they would take whatever we could give them.
Yeah.
And you didn't really need to look elsewhere. And we're connected on the same continent. You don't have to ship it across the Rockies or across the oceans. And it worked out quite well until the shale revolution. So the United States was very dependent on imports until that hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling kind of revolution opened up so much more of their basins, and their production went up. Now they're the world's biggest producer of oil and natural gas, but still a net importer. And we provide the bulk of those imports. That is when we started to say, well, maybe we should do a Trans Mountain or a Northern Gateway. The United States is flooded now in this oil. We're getting a lower price for ours. And so we should look for other customers. Obviously, we could talk about that whole decade of difficulties in pipelines and trying to build through BC. But now we have Trans Mountain, is that full? It's already full. It hasn't been even 2 years. It's already full. And now, obviously, the Canadian oil is looking very attractive, not only because we don't have to go through any of those choke points. You referred to the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, which is now, with the Houthis, is now another choke point that's becoming an issue concern. The Strait of Hormuz, Panama Canal is another one. It actually has had issues in the last 2 years of having lower levels, and so you couldn't get as many ships and as big of a ships. So Canada is blessed to have the Atlantic side and the West Coast side, but particularly on the West Coast, straight shot to the rich economies in Northern Asia, and that's what is making us so attractive right now.
One thing that we've always even talked about on our pod too is that we've had to always ship our oil down to the States to get refined. Like we had refineries, but they got closed out. Maybe it's part of the whole green movement. And it's all this environmentalist, not to slag environmentalists, but like not in my backyard. Like we know it's being refined, just not here. So it's ruining the environment somewhere. And
But I'd be interested to hear that on your side there, Heather. I feel like, again, that is more because of the trade stuff that US and Canada did. It was like, hey, we'll export you guys the oil. You guys can refine it. And again, that's even our logging industry. We did the same thing. We keep cutting the trees down here and we just sign it to them. They do it. And we've shut up all our lumber mills. If you go down into Washington State, like every 100 kilometers is a freaking lumber mill. Where here in BC, I mean, everything's closing up. There is no lumber mills anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and there was a whole episode of deindustrialization that Canada obviously faced, but Europe also, to some extent, the United States, maybe a bit less than us, of energy intensive, more dirtier kind of midstream processing moved to China in the last 25 years, and refining capacity as well. Now, in some ways, it was consolidation in Canada. And if you didn't care about the region, you'd say, well, actually, Canada roughly refines as many products as it consumes. It's just that we find a lot in Alberta and ship it down, and then and out east they have to import a little bit more. So and there's some reason for that, is that you do tend to want to refine where your market is, because every market we tend to think is just diesel and gasoline, but it's a bit more complicated than that. And different markets will have different end uses for that, and so you want to refine it to a particular specification that region is going to use, for example, in their heavy industry. But certainly there's no one going to be making a new refinery in Vancouver, anytime soon. You can imagine how uncompetitive it would be. But I wonder if that's going to change, you guys, because, you may have noticed the price of crude dropped. It went as high as, I think, $140 for Brent after the strait was closed, which is high, historically high. Came back down to 70. Now is somewhere around 90 when we're recording it. But the refining margins have just grown and grown and grown. And there's not enough refining capacity operating in the world today. And there's a real deficit. And part of that is because Ukraine has been hammering Russian refining capacity. Russia is usually a huge net exporter of refined products. It is now importing gasoline from India. So a total reversal of the situation. They've lost, I've heard, almost half of their refining capacity. So I do wonder if some people will say, okay, the ones that we have maybe we want to expand, probably not a new greenfield, but maybe an expansion of what we already have here in Canada. And even with that Northern Shield pipeline in Ontario, Doug Ford and Minister Lecce talked about making Sarnia, this energy hub in Canada, and that's largely centered on refining. So we'll see how things shake out going forward here.
So speaking of Ontario, they are proposing this other Alberta Ontario pipeline, but I've been kind of doing, you know, Gemini research, like what's the likelihood of that happening? And you can comment on it. Is it more of a pie in the sky heading out east versus the west looks like it's actually going to happen, whereas the east, is it more like a pipe dream?
Yeah, and since Trump was elected, Danielle Smith has come out, said we want to double production and we want to go pipelines, northeast, west, south. And in fact, I think we just want pipelines west and south. So we can talk about the Arctic northern ones. You don't have to think too hard to understand why a 3-month seasonal, port for oil exports might be difficult to get the economics to work. But on that eastern one, there is a few more reasons why it just hasn't gone away. One was you did have that Energy East proposal a few years ago, about a decade ago, and eventually kind of the pipeline politics got in its way. That TC Energy was going to advance. But situations have changed. TC Energy had some unused pipe that it's now using for natural gas. And so the economics have very much changed on the Energy East. And the other consideration was that we do send Alberta oil to Sarnia, to Ontario, through an Enbridge pipeline, but it happens to go underneath the Great Lakes instead of over the Great Lakes because it's very expensive and difficult to build through the Canadian Shield. And the governor of Michigan has said, since 2020, trying to shut it down. Again, kind of just Democrat anti-pipeline sentiment probably has decreased a little bit, but still it is a risk that Michigan could have shut that down and disrupted it. So that's what's behind it. And just this, not wanting to depend on the United States for anything, wanting to have that energy security, that sovereignty, that independence here. But it would be tremendously expensive. I don't think, you wouldn't really produce more out of Alberta because it would be the same oil. You're just shipping it north instead of south. So you're not collecting more royalties. You're not attracting an investment. You're literally just rerouting it. And so they're just at the feasibility stage. They'd have to justify. I'd be curious to see how they justify the expense. So I still think that's more pie in the sky. The West Coast one, we can get into it. That one makes tremendous economic sense, even though we know it'll be expensive and even though we know there's no private proponent. If you do the math, that's still going to be a huge net benefit. You'll be able to see it in Canada's GDP.
And do you think there, Heather, like obviously we know what the expansion for TMX, what it increased by from what it was meant to be when it was just owned before, when everything increased there, because they have a lot of the infrastructure now in place there,
Right.
like along that same right of way, like what if how again, I want to put you on the bus of what you think the cost would be. I mean, what was the final cost even for the expansion? I think it was like 9 billion, or was it it was either 9 to 12. I can't remember what it ended up being, but it
More
was
than that. It
it was
was
meant to be 3 billion is what it used to be, and then it went nuts.
it went nuts to 34 billion,
Oh my
unfortunately.
god, that's yeah, that is
I'm sorry
that's
you're having to hear this for the first time.
yeah, I knew
Uh,
it was, I just kinda stuck. I worked a lot on the Trans Mountain, the current one that was built in the '50s, and I always like to say, like, it is some of the best pipeline, like, I've traveled all over Canada and the US working on pipelines, and it was, like, some of the best pipeline I've ever seen. It's
Yeah,
like
and that was built in 1953.
yeah,
It was started as a special act of parliament, by the way. That was a government-led pipeline, and within 2 years of that act of parliament, it was built and operating. And
yeah,
that was with 1950s technology. So just to put in perspective, it does not need to take 6 or 7 or 10 or 12 years.
no,
It doesn't. But now it does. So that original one was 300,000 barrels a day and was mostly to feed the Vancouver and the BC area to get it
yeah,
across the Rockies, make Canada self-sufficient. That's why we did it. And also had benefits, for example, in the Washington state area. The Trans Mountain expansion, or TMX, added another 590,000 barrels. And all of that is destined for exports. And before it was built, most people thought it mostly be going to the American West Coast, to California and Oregon, and serving, especially the California market. They do a lot of heavy refining. But in fact, most of it has gone to Asia and most of it has gone to China. And so those countries in Asia started to get experience with our crude quality, and have loved it and like it. And that's why you see it's already full. That 890,000 barrel pipeline is now already full. Trans Mountain has a plan to increase it with some fairly low-hanging, optimization techniques to another 300,000. So you'll be at roughly 1.2 million barrels. There's a ready appetite for that. And now this West Coast oil pipeline will be another million on top of it. So it's getting significant, such that some of the bigger traders and global traders who never cared about Canada, never needed to. You didn't need to trade globally our oil, are now setting up shop in Calgary, and Canadian oil is of global interest. I always say
And
we were a globally sized producer, fourth
yeah.
largest producer in the world, but only a regional player, a minor regional player, because we are in North America with the United States. Finally, now we're becoming that global kind of energy producer that we always could have been.
And can you there, Heather, help people understand like how like when people set up like a new pipeline, like when people are paying for those exports, like they're paying for the barrels. Even sometimes that pipeline may not always produce that exact amount of barrels, but they usually have contracts set in place of like, hey, I don't care if you don't want 500,000, you only want 200, you're still paying me for the 500. Can you help
Yeah, and
explain some of that?
that's what we call the take or pay. So that is more common on natural gas because the
Yeah,
market for LNG isn't, as we say, as commoditized as oil. Oil is almost a perfect market in an economic sense, in that it's quite transparent. You can count inventories, you can count barrels. The price is very transparent, and people will either buy on the spot market or they'll hedge in advance, like you're saying, and buy a certain amount for the longer term. And one thing about crude is that refiners are set up to process a certain quality of crude, whether it's kind of a light or a medium or a heavy or a sour or a sweet. And so you are tied a little bit as a refinery to get a kind of crude from a smaller number of players. And
yeah,
so we do want them to like Canadian crude and optimize their refiners for our crude. And therefore there's an interest on both sides to make that a more reliable relationship and take a certain amount of offtake, a bit, not just kind of the spot, the daily tanker that you might, fetch off the market. LNG is very different. Whereas you really are taking, like a 20-year, a 10-year, a 20-year, I'm going to take it, I'm going to offtake. There is a much smaller spot market in LNG, although that's maturing and that's developing a little bit more time where there is a bit more spot available. And usually buyers like to have, a more commoditized market. It gives them a few more options. But for the West Coast oil pipeline, you say, well, who's going to buy this? It is very much thought that, first of all, Asia is a growing market. India is growing, this fastest growing oil market. They may have some interest. They have some heavy oil refiners. Southeast Asia is growing. But really, who we're probably going to sell to mostly is still Japan and Korea, because they would be willing probably to put some equity in. They want to guarantee that energy security. They don't need their oil market to grow. They would just get rid of some of their, what they're buying from the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz, too dependent on that risky region, and replace some of that with Canadian oil. So we don't need them to be a growing market to have our market share be growing in those countries. And of course, China will still continue to buy, we expect.
So Alex and I were kind of like debating on like this West Coast pipeline. Is it brand new pipeline being laid, or are they just kind of expanding the what's current coming down to the West Coast? Is it almost like essentially expanding a highway almost kind of thing? Like that kind of
Good
sense?
question. So I told you, so there's the 890 today, and there that 300,000 barrels that they plan to optimize to 2028 is just that. They're optimizing what already exists. It's the different pressure and the dilution and flow through that allows them to export a little bit more. But the West Coast oil pipeline will be a new pipeline, and they'll try to use the same route where they can, the same right of way, to your point, Alex. But it'll
And
have
yeah, sorry, Alex. When we talk, that's what I meant. Not that there was already a pipeline. It's the right of way. It's the hey
yeah.
that they're going to be building along the same routes of not having to ideally excavate or blast. Like that's where ideally help them speed things up. Where hey, if they had to build a brand new route to the Rockies, it probably wouldn't happen.
Yeah, it would be more expensive, but which is to say, it still doesn't mean it's easy to twin or triple a pipeline beside an existing pipeline, because now there's a lot more risk. You
Yeah,
do not want to interfere with that pipeline. You don't want to have any accidents on that pipeline. And through the Rockies, it's not like the right of way can accommodate another whole pipeline. They may have to blast beside it. And so there will be some areas where technically it will be very challenging to go beside that pipeline. Will be expensive, but that's just how it is. You don't have a lot of options, and people may not appreciate almost all the oil production. North America is quite rich in oil and gas in Mexico, Canada, and the United States. We're the biggest, we're a I think a bigger producing region in the Middle East right now. But almost all that production is on the east side of the Cordillera. So we have the Rocky Mountains, but that thing goes all the way to the south of Chile. And almost no one, gets it across that Cordillera into the Pacific Basin. And so if they do want to serve it to Asia, they have to go through the Panama Canal, or they have to go all the way underneath Chile. And so that means the Atlantic Basin, all the countries in Europe and Africa and North America and South America who share the Atlantic, pretty well served oil basin. There's lots of oil coming into that market, but the Pacific is relatively underserved. And that's why it's so magical for Canada to be able to actually cross the Rockies. Yes, it's expensive and difficult, but the prize of that is that you are supplying oil directly in the Pacific Basin without all those choke points. And there's very few other options that can do that.
Hey guys, Alex Pang here, your favorite Canadian Mortgage Show co-host. You've heard us talk about all things mortgages, but if you have questions about your own mortgage, or you're thinking about buying, refinancing, or renewing, send us an email at info@canadianmortgageshow.com. We're always happy to help. That's info@canadianmortgageshow.com. Now, back to the show. So there was some sort of political stuff for the West Coast pipeline that they would avoid the North Coast, or like, is that, yeah, like Prince Rupert area, about the tanker ban still in place. Like, can you talk about that? Like,
Yeah,
is
I
that
would
why?
love to, because it's kind of ridiculous. And I don't, it is, Trans Mountain already has a route. We already have a federally, owned company that runs a pipeline, to the West Coast. So in that sense, it's convenient. But if there was no politics and no history and no people, you would probably run it to the North Coast. So why aren't we doing that? In that decade where people hated pipelines, there was so much opposition to pipelines. Northern Gateway was coming about. The oil sands were building up. We were looking for other markets because the shale revolution in the United States, and Northern Gateway was an obvious solution. But so much environmental opposition, concentrated around Northern Gateway. And they were successful. In 2015, Trudeau came in and on his platform, he said, I'm not going to allow Northern Gateway to go through. I'm going to reject it. And in fact, he did do that. And it wasn't enough injury and insult to reject Northern Gateway after Enbridge had spent $600 million. And by the way, the regulator had approved it. So that was, a terrible moment in Canadian investment certainty that scared away $1 trillion of capital after. It wasn't enough insult to reject a previously approved pipeline that was well on its way. They also had to have a tanker ban to prevent any such project from moving forward again ever. And so they made a moratorium area on oil tankers going out of that area, basically from the tip of Vancouver Island, probably close to you, I'm guessing, Alex Shanks, all the way to the Alaska border. And that meant, there would be no Northern Gateway, and there'd be nothing like a Northern Gateway. And of course, the justification was this is, pristine, this is a perfect area. We couldn't possibly have an oil spill. Well, of course, there's hardly any oil spills. You could prevent oil spills. You could spend the money and make it very safe. We have oil coming in and out of Vancouver. We have oil coming in out of Atlantic Canada, out of Montreal, and it hasn't harmed anyone. But not only that, Prince Rupert is Canada's third largest port. So now you're telling me that Prince Rupert, is in such dangerous, inaccessible waters. And by the way, there's lots of communities that are dependent on diesel that go, that the diesel gets brought in, by ship to those remote communities on the BC coast, and there's no other way to do it. And the one from a 1 million barrel tanker would be much, much more safe. And so for me, that was never a good environmental excuse. It was not scientific. The Canadian Energy Regulator had looked at this, had approved it, knowing that tankers would have to go through the Kitimat, Prince Rupert area. But at any rate, it's become an issue. And I think one reason Carney's willing to spend the money to develop the port in Vancouver is to avoid political backlash from his own Liberal caucus, his own Liberal MPs, around where you guys live, who didn't want that northern route used.
Yeah, me and Heather talked offline. Probably the reason why David Eby finally relented and said, I'm not gonna reject this, or I'm not gonna fight this. because we're a housing podcast, but we got this BC condo bailout. Like you get the bailout, but you got to let us do the pipelines through your province. And I'm sure EB's like, okay, my I'm probably going to get voted out in the next election anyway. Here's my last straw to save face.
And I
But
mean, it may be well, and again, like what Tyler's talking about, like everyone for like especially the BC and Vancouver folk that think like there's no oil going on in their backyard, is they don't even realize the pipelines that run under their streets, the refineries that are here, and everything, and the stuff like, hey, there had been spills in the past, but when stuff happens, there's protocols that are built to make sure that doesn't happen again. Again, that's like saying that, hey, there's never going to be an earthquake. There is going to be earthquakes, and people still keep building homes. Think of the hurricanes in Florida. How do those people keep building the homes in the exact same spot? But again, like that's where they have to do it. But there's things put in place, and that's where the pipeline and stuff has been in Vancouver forever. And again, it's we have many protocols now to make sure their sensors are so much more like sensitive. Hey, maybe before some stuff maybe leaked out, but now it's like, hey, as soon as they see a single pressure drop, they have people searching that entire line to say, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a very sophisticated and for good reason. Like the liability of an oil spill these days in North America and Vancouver area would be phenomenal. Companies don't want to pay it. It's well worth, and to get insurance, they have to, have good tankers. So the system has been set up to not want to have spills. There are very few spills, and to your point, there's been oil coming in of that harbor in Vancouver and in and of, Prince Rupert. Like, how do you think the people of Prince Rupert get their
And
oil?
then even let's talk about those like the big storage containers. It's like, hey, yes, maybe they're not carrying oil right now, but a lot of those like they have containers that fall off all the time with just vehicles and stuff and the other stuff like those that happens. And so are we going to say, all right, no more tankers allowed up here ever again? We're not even going to let a boat that has oil into the waters anymore. Is that like what we're going to say that way?
No, our risk tolerance is very, twisted, and we don't tend to understand all the risk around us and how it's mitigated. And people get scared. We talk about data centers, that oh my God, data centers use water. Well, wait till you hear about all the other things that use water. Wait till you hear about the other things that draw power. So I think people just need a bit more literacy of the products that get moved, dangerous goods that get moved around them every single day on the highways that they drive on.
And that's
yeah,
again, we have to remember this like, hey, would we rather be on a train or being driven, or would we rather be on a massive tanker? Like the risk. And again, BC has some of the best like boat pilots in all of the world. The other people that are driving these tankers, they are not driving it into our waters. They're bringing it. And then a pilot is coming on the boat that only specializes in that area. That's all they do every single day. That's all they do. They don't go anywhere else.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's been a lot of risk mitigation, and that's why. Again, like, did people even notice when TMX, got full? They didn't, because it doesn't really affect them on a day to day.
well, you know what? You kind of touched on our next topic about data centers. I mean, Meta is investing 13 billion into your backyard in Sturgeon County. I don't know geographically where it is, but it's closer to you than it is to us. I mean, hey, what are your thoughts on that as well?
Well, I mean, I was delighted. And we've obsessed in this country a little bit about LNG and pipelines, and those are obviously super important. But in the meantime, in the last 3 years, the area of global capital, the biggest expenditures in the world, was in data centers and related energy infrastructure. And it was getting spent elsewhere, hardly at all in Canada. And so, you saw these hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of capex going to places that weren't Canada, and we were really missing out. And part of we can get into it is things like the clean electricity regulations were preventing it, but finally we're getting a piece of it. And one reason why the United States GDP has outshone Canada, Europe, everyone else so much recently is obviously because of the Magnificent Seven and the tech, and also the money being poured into data centers and related energy. And so finally, we're getting a piece of the pie. Alberta has a very coherent and well thought out, I think, AI strategy. They've worked on it for a long time, marrying it with their electricity policy, and have a plan to attract $100 billion in AI data centers. And I think they think they're on the path to get there. And so it will be, maybe as big of a surge of investment in the next few years as oil, at least, on par. Maybe you can't get the oil sands, but it's huge for sure.
And again, we've
Yeah,
taught
Alex.
we're a housing podcast, so obviously, hey, me and Alex, we only make money from real estate. But again, do I want my only economy running on housing? No. Do we only want our only economy running on oil? No. Do we want our only economy running on AI? No. Like we want a nice share. when you're investing your own money, you don't put everything into one basket. You have it like diverse, and that's what Canada needs to do.
Yeah, and let me tell you, like, it's a huge opportunity for Alberta. It is as big of an opportunity for BC, but you simply will not accept that opportunity. And the opportunity exists because we're a bit colder and because we have this excess of natural gas. And the excess is, coming from the BC side as well. You have just as much natural gas. You'll probably beat Alberta in production in a few years. So you have that cheap, abundant natural gas that you could use as well. The thing that BC doesn't have is a deregulated electricity market. And sometimes in Alberta, that's good, sometimes it's bad, but it is very good for attracting these kinds of big investments where private sector can move at the pace of the private sector and they can make deals for themselves and not have to worry about a crown utility and the social license and the commission and the regulator to the extent that you would in BC Hydro. But it is, there could be a way where you could do behind the meter, bring your own power, and start welcoming data centers. But as it is, because BC Hydro is now short on electricity, because you've been a net importer the last 3 years, because building a site E or 2 hydro dams is going to take a long time, BC actually put in regulations to prevent data centers and crypto mining from attaching to the grid. There are very strict circumstances in which they can have data centers. And because they're trying to preserve that power for people and for LNG and for mining.
Speaking of alternative energy sources, we have another colleague from a different pod that talks about this, and I'm curious about it too. Why have we not explored nuclear? Because nuclear has been known to be clean. Is it just because people are scared about the whole Chernobyl thing, 50 years ago, that it might happen here? All that? Like, what do you
Yeah,
think?
I mean, that's a big part of it. So even before pipelines and data centers are now, pipelines were the target the last decade. Looks like data centers will be the target this decade. Well, the environmental movement really grew up around the anti-nuclear movement, and it was, conflated with the Cold War and the arms race, and a feeling of, the apocalypse is coming if we have a nuclear war. So certainly true those fears, but then, Fukushima or Chernobyl happened, Long Mile Island happened, and then 3 Mile Island, sorry, and now obviously Fukushima. So people were scared, and because of the regulations people put in to prevent that from happening again, nuclear actually became very expensive at the same time as natural gas became very cheap.
Mhm.
And so for the last 20 years, I have to say, it has mostly been simply an economic issue that, especially in North America, natural gas has been so cheap. And then, to a certain, we can talk about, levelized cost of energy and why solar is cheap, in some ways and expensive in others. But there were just cheaper ways to add electricity than nuclear. Nuclear was relatively more expensive. After 2022 is when the nuclear story and uranium story has turned around a little bit. It was pretty unpopular. They were still building in China and kind of, some places, some countries in the East. But in the West, no one was financing it, no one was building it, and the handful of builds that were going ahead went over budget, were very expensive, and we're seeing it as disasters. So now we're in a different era where energy security is king, and nuclear not only is reliable, firm power, but also pretty much emissions free. But it is still very difficult to finance, and it's still expensive to build. So we have, if on Ontario, they're looking at more nuclear. They're very experienced in nuclear. If you look at it on a horizon of 40 or 60 years, nuclear has a great return on investment. If you look at it on a horizon of 20 or 25 years, which, all private capital would, it's a terrible return on investment. And so you do need, utilities or government financing, and that's how they do it in South Korea and France, to make that work. But still in places like BC and Quebec, where you're a bit more progressive, bit more left-wing orientation, more environmentalist, nuclear is still a little bit taboo.
Mm.
And I think, though, as it gets cheaper and as it becomes clear that solar and wind cannot provide all the clean energy that societies and industries need, I think nuclear will just keep getting more popular. And you've already seen the public opinion polling around the world swing pretty wildly dramatically since 2022.
And yeah, that's like in China. How many have they started? Like, I think, and again, they maybe said that they were going to start, but like I thought it was a large amount. Like their goal was to be building like a new nuclear plant like every 2 years or something.
Yeah, I think in the world we're building about 80. That's the number that I have in my head, so don't quote me. But I think we're at about 80. And nuclear. A lot of nuclear was built in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And by the way, after the last oil crisis, the OPEC oil embargo in the 70s, nuclear came kind of in that energy crisis, and was built, just 100 gigawatts, I think, in a few years in the United States. So we've had big, huge nuclear buildouts in the West, but they all kind of stopped being built after the Chernobyl, and so you've actually seen a decline in nuclear energy. But globally, they've continued to be built such that in 2025 was another record year for nuclear energy power production, but obviously not being driven by the West. So I think we're all hopeful that there will be a renaissance, we say, or a new wave of nuclear. Certainly, the plans that OECD countries, rich Western countries, have made would indicate that there will be a nuclear renaissance in the West. Ontario is part of it, and we'll see if that trickles through. Canada's put out a nuclear strategy, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks ago, and it talked about having 10 large reactors built or being built in about the next 20 years.
And I mean, with the data, like to me, again, the energy and stuff. Hey, we know in BC, we can't fund it we can't, not by not fund it, I mean money, I mean actually give the energy away because we don't have it on our grid already. And we built the Site C and it's already, the energy's gone. And so if we want to be doing the other stuff, like we have to be bringing energy in, or are we going to go back to burning coal? That's really the options.
Yeah, I mean, one of the options looks like, if Alberta has a plan for a very large reactor complex, and it would absolutely be positioned to supply energy to the BC Northeast. That is part of the plan, but of course that's a ways off, and it is hard for nuclear to compete in Alberta and BC with natural gas because our natural gas is practically free, and so it's a particularly challenging jurisdiction for nuclear, and yet there is a proponent of large scale nuclear in Alberta. So we'll see how far they get.
Nice. We have one topic I want to talk about. I don't know if it's part of your purview, but uh, vehicles. The auto industry is getting killed in Ontario, largely because we are bringing Chinese EVs into Canada. And personally, I'm very interested to see how cheap these EVs, because I'm interested to see like what are your thoughts on that changing the auto industry here?
Yeah, I mean, lots unpack there, and I do think about this because there's quite a few, kind of threads we can pull here. One is that Chinese EVs only started coming. There's a few Tesla made, Chinese made Teslas that have been here, but this is new. So the problems that the Canadian auto manufacturing sector is facing is not primarily due to those Chinese EVs yet. Why they were under such stress is because the Trudeau government, and then in BC and Quebec, also had, EV mandates. And in Canada in particular, they wanted, the manufacturing to switch and invested heavily in batteries and in this transition. And the transition never came. Consumers in North America, which is where all of Canada's cars are sold into, we don't sell cars to Germany and Korea. We sell cars here in North America. We're not that bullish on EVs. They just were not buying EVs at the pace that we all thought. And those three big car manufacturers took tens of billions of dollars of write-offs. It was a bad bet. They lost money. They lost money on every single EV they sold. And they've pivoted back to where they make money, which is SUVs and trucks. And so Canada had these EV mandates that absolutely did not match up with the real world. There were not going to be the vehicles for them. The companies, spent tens of billions of dollars trying to provide that. The Canadian consumer did not want it. The American consumer did not want it. It was very expensive and detrimental for them. And so Canada has had to roll back the EV mandate. So did BC and Quebec, the timelines in which they wanted all these EVs to replace the internal combustion engine. But now Carney has said, okay, we won't have the EV mandate, but we're going to have a much stricter emissions, regulation. And that almost puts the Canadian auto manufacturing sector in the same position, because once again, they cannot build the cars that they make money off, that the Canadian consumer wants, and they cannot make the cars that can sell on the American market. And I mean, we're working in the same market. You cannot parse off the cars we make in Canada to only serve the Canadian consumer and not serve both markets. So this is a discussion paper, kind of right now, but the auto manufacturing group is again saying, again, you're killing us again. And I am shocked by it, because I think out west we get used to the, auto levels taking us for granted, not caring about our sectors. I cannot believe that they keep putting on these punishing regulations onto the Ontario auto manufacturing sector. And the quid pro quo is they say, well, we're subsidizing all these other things. But, at some point, the market realities are much more important than government subsidies. And so far, it's worked out very poorly for us.
Yeah, I know, like Alex and I being on the West Coast, it's obviously more mild here.
Mhm.
EVs are a bigger thing on the West Coast and along like, hey, even like Oregon, California, because it's warm enough.
Yes.
I can't see EVs really surviving in cold weather where you lose like 20-30% of your charge. And people still have range anxiety where like I don't want to drive and all of a sudden like I'm out of batteries and I'm stuck in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
Um,
And I've been, in Vancouver obviously recently, and you see all the Rivian trucks and they're nice and all the Teslas and those are nice vehicles. So to get to the Chinese, I didn't even touch on the Chinese aspect. You know, there are, I have security concerns. So far from the competition, there are security concerns with Chinese EVs, and they have used it as a wedge to get into and distort Western manufacturing sectors, and it is a danger. Now, I'm from Saskatchewan originally, and I like canola, so I'm like, well, I really want to sell more canola to China, and maybe this is a satisfactory exchange. But this is definitely an eyes wide open kind of a situation, and we'll see how that plays out. But it'll be very interesting. Obviously, it's creating some tensions with the Americans. We'll see how much benefit we can get from opening up the market to the Chinese EVs or not.
I mean, we've always long talked about Canada. We just love our oligopolies, like our banking, airlines, cell phones. It's like it's controlled by like the top 3 or 5 companies
Mhm.
in each industry. If we opened up to competition, what it does, it improves quality, it brings prices down, and it's
But
free
again,
market.
the problem, this is what we did back in the day, even talking about like imports and exports. It's like, hey, we all used to do manufacturing in Canada and US. We then sent it all over to Asia. And again, if we start saying we're going to buy all their vehicles, well, we're just not going to do anything here. They're then going to get the market share. It's like, hey, we want your vehicles, but we want you to bring manufacturing here to Canada. Like that's really what needs to happen. Is be like, hey, you guys have built a better process than we have. Let's start up shop here. We'll help give you guys will make money from it. We'll get your cars to that market. But if we just buy them from it, it's we're going to be in the same issue as we are with our oil right now and even with our logging industry.
Yeah, and I'll say that was the same concern with the Japanese, kind of automobile rush, and then we were successful in getting some manufacturing of those in North America, and everyone's happy to buy whatever kind of car they want. But but this is a real issue. I'm more of a political scientist, and I think about the security side of things. It is very important to have manufacturing capacity, and you've seen in previous wars, and not least World War II, the ability to make automobiles was very consistent with the ability to make tanks and other equipment that helped win. Was the arsenal of democracy, which won World War II. And there are other countries like Australia where they have lost automobile manufacturing capacity, and so there is a security aspect to this of what kind of industrial base do we want to have? Do we need to keep? And unfortunately, because we protect so much of our manufacturing, they have become less competitive on a global scale. They are protected, and they are not as hungry or as lean probably as they would be otherwise. But it's a very tough balance. And this is one issue where to me it is not black and white. There are real legitimate reasons on the one side why you'd want to open it up to Chinese EVs, and on the other why you'd want to restrict it. And it's going to be very very tricky to find. There is no balance here. There will be trade offs.
Yeah.
Maybe I have a simplistic view, but I'm like, yeah, they have spyware, but I mean, they could see us on our phones anyway. I'm like, I'm not that important, man. I'm like, geez, I'm going to the bathroom. I'm going wherever. Just so maybe I have a more
Well,
naive.
I think more to Heather's point, it's not even like the security that way. It's more security if we don't have any manufacturing. Let's say Asia does all the manufacturing, we close up all the shops and everything. Well, then we can't do anything. We can't even start up manufacturing, and that's where same with our imports. Like, hey, we would love people would buy Canadian goods if it was built here, if it was at an even if it was a little bit higher, but it's just so cheap there. We've made that happen. We sent everything over there, and now it's never going to come back because everyone's going to be like, well, I'm not paying $100 when I can get it over here for $10.
Yeah, and you can have a defense industrial base if you don't have an industrial base.
Yeah.
But at the same time, consumers want material well-being, and we want good purchasing power. And it's very tricky. Obviously, over the last 15 years, I think everyone would agree we went too far to just allowing this hyper globalization. We lost capabilities, and maybe Trump is going too far on the other end. To kind of
Exactly. So he's bringing it back and saying, hey, we're going to do it there, which is great. But then you're going to have no one else that wants to deal with you ever again.
yeah. That's tricky balance. I don't think China has it right either, for what it's worth.
We have it in here. It's not even this is where we're going to talk about some of this, but I more want to talk about your thoughts with like obviously the pipelines and everything, but like we're going to talk about some First Nation stuff, but like what about them owning ownerships and that and stuff? Like what is your thoughts and take on that?
Yeah, so we talked about that era where pipelines were very unpopular, and it is true that environmental groups often weaponized, I would say, First Nations opposition because they have particular legal rights that were very strong in delaying or challenging these projects. And it's, I would call it, people have called it eco-colonialism. And I thought, there are legitimate First Nations concerns and interests in development, but that it was manipulated in many ways by environmental groups. And as a response to that, when we had Northern Gateway canceled and Energy East and all these and Trans Mountain kind of blowing up in Alberta, there was a sense that, we need to do something better to make First Nations partners in this and not opponents. And that is when Jason Kenney and the Indian Resource Council, my friend Stephen Buffalo was the president there, came up with this idea of guaranteed Indigenous loans for equity. In Alberta, we call it the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. That was 2019. And the idea was that, well, let's help them become equity owners in this, and that the governments will give a loan guarantee. So it's not a government loan. That's the First Nations are going to the bank and the government is guaranteeing it, just like someone would on a mortgage, right? If you couldn't afford the mortgage, and they get the government's cost of capital. So instead of the First Nations having to raise in the markets and probably you're getting 12 or 15% cost of capital, you're getting Alberta's cost of capital, which is maybe, 3 or 4% depending on the year. And that the difference between their cost of capital and Alberta's cost of capital, we're talking about a 10% difference. Well, that's the difference between making money as an equity stakeholder or losing money every single day on that asset. So this has been wildly successful. There's now 5,000 kilometers of pipeline in Canada that have an Indigenous equity owner or equity option. And it's been so successful that BC has adopted similar things, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and even the federal government. And the federal market created a very large fund. Alberta's was $1 billion, and they moved it up to $3 billion because of all the interest. The Canadian fund is worth $10 billion. So if you think on average, First Nations are going to get a 20% equity stake, well, that's kind of $200 billion of equity in projects that you've unlocked. So that seems to be a secret sauce, and it makes First Nations partners in a project. And when the project is doing well, when you are full, you are getting more money. If you can build that pipeline faster, you can get more money. So it kind of puts everyone on the same side. And I absolutely expect that it's been said, but on the West Coast oil pipeline, it's obvious that there's going to need to be an equity portion of this. One interesting thing people might know is that Trans Mountain, because it was so over budget, there's been an issue with the tolls, what the upstream producers or shippers pay tolls to pay for the use of the pipeline. It was just settled about 2 weeks ago. I don't think it's coincidental with the MOU at all. What it means is that you can now value that Trans Mountain pipeline system, and that means that you could give an equity share to First Nations, knowing exactly how much revenue is now coming in the long term.
Okay.
Well, Heather, this has been great. We're short on time. Where can we find you?
So I work for a think tank, Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So all my stuff that I write is for free. There's no paywall there. You can find it. You just look up my name or look up the energy program for all my writing. And I'm also prolific on X, probably spend too much time on X, at Exner-Pirot.
Hey, I actually take some of our content from your account. So you're one of the accounts I follow. And, we've talked online. I'm trying to get my account reinstated. Hopefully that happens.
Where you can share and boost, but I'll share and boost you until that happens,
yes.
Alex.
So folks, this has been Heather Exner-Pirot joining us on the Canadian Mortgage Show. Heather, thanks for your time. Folks, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Heather. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, make sure to follow us. Please give us a 5-star rating. You can even send us an email because we want to know what you guys want to hear about. That's what we're here for. Reach out anytime.